started, and that will be available to you. So welcome to this webinar, Mentoring with Safety. It's a webinar about how any interaction with other people triggers responses in our brain. And these are automatic reactions. We're usually not aware of them, but they can have a dramatic impact on how we think, how we feel, and as a result, what we do. Evolution has ensured that our brain's first function is to keep us safe, physically and emotionally. And since every interaction may be perceived as a threat or reward, the brain responds. So in this webinar, we're going to be looking at five ways the brain seeks safety, the impact of your dominant drivers, what managers and mentors can do to build trust and minimize defense mode. Now, if you're on my newsletter list, you may have seen articles that I've written recently on these topics. If you're not on the list, I'm going to pop you on the list and so that you get future newsletters. But on the webinar worksheet, and if you're watching the live webinar, I sent that out to you earlier today, or you can download it now. If you're watching the recording, the worksheet will be available to download underneath the recording there. And there's a link where you can access some previous articles. If you want to do that, you'll be able to download those as well. The important aspect of what we're talking about this is you'll be discovering it's actually difficult, if not impossible, to have constructive conversations with someone who is operating in that defense mode. It's very difficult. It puts up a barrier to communication. So we'll talk about that. For those who may not know me, my name's Anne Rolfe, and I have a background in adult learning and career counselling, as well as professional development. I've run my consulting business for over 30 years, and I specialise in mentoring. I've specialised in that for over 2 decades. My latest book is Mentoring Mindset, Skills and Tools, and I've spoken on this topic in Australia, Canada, China, Singapore, the Philippines, and in the USA. And these webinars are attended by people in all parts of the world. So welcome to everyone. I speak mainly from a corporate perspective, but I've worked in not-for-profit organisations, educational institutions, government agencies, and also community groups. So the content is applicable there also. And this topic in particular, it's applicable not just to mentoring, or even managing others. It's important in any interaction we have with anyone, anytime. So I think you're going to find value and relevance for every aspect of your life. And I'll certainly be asking you to share your personal insights and the applications you see for this information during and at the end of the webinar. For those of you participating live, you can type in questions, observations, comments at any time. And if you're watching the recording, use the link below the video to add your comments to the blog post. So let's get into our content today. Neuroscientists describe the minimize danger, maximize reward as the fundamental organizing principle of the brain. So what I plan to share with you are some of the recent discoveries in neuroscience, and then workshop how to apply them in mentoring and indeed in other relationships. Now, the way our brains work, our brains actually work differently when emotions trigger neurochemicals that flood the brain. We actually hear differently and see differently and even process differently and behave differently. So trust activates the prefrontal cortex of the brain, our executive function. That's at the front, just behind our forehead. And that executive function, you may be interested to know, is not fully developed until 25 years of age or older. Females develop a little in the early 20s and males a little bit later. So when you ask a question like, what were they thinking? Actually, maybe they weren't thinking so well because the executive function had not yet fully developed. But no matter how mature or able to self-regulate we are, emotional reactions affect us all. In fact, 5 times per second, the brain evaluates the environment for threat or reward. This is an automatic and usually non-conscious action, as natural as breathing. It's designed to protect us from pain and propel us towards pleasure. Humans would not survive without the brain's inbuilt threat, reward, vigilance, and systematic response. And don't wait for me to invite you. If you have a comment or an observation or even a question, please feel free to type it in as we go. I will pause shortly and look at those questions coming in. So this idea of the brain having kind of almost like an automatic switch between threat and reward, trust and fear, means that it activates the amygdala and triggers a primal survival response. And you've no doubt heard of the fight or flight reaction. It's actually fight, flight, or freeze. And there are physical changes associated with that. Heart rate goes up, blood pressure, perspiration, digestion shuts down, blood sugar goes up, and that's all gearing our body for a burst of energy that will help us run away from that threat, fight it off, or freeze, hoping to be invisible. Now, usually, hopefully, we're not often in situations where we literally have to fight or run for our lives, but every interaction has the potential to trigger that defense mode in our brain. And there's a threat scale. In the work environment, it can range from a minor embarrassment. So maybe you say something at a meeting and someone gives you a funny look, and that's kind of embarrassing, to a major fear-inducing situation like a demotion or potential or thinking you might lose your job. Now remember, the threat might not be physical, but your body is gearing up for a physical response. Your body is getting ready for a fight or to run away or to shut down and become invisible so you don't get eaten. And so it's surprisingly easy to trip that switch for defend mode in someone else. And it might be a look, a tone of voice, a word, and the brain can't tell the difference between a real threat and an imagined one. And you know this. I wonder if you've ever watched a scary movie and you felt your heart thumping away, and maybe you've nearly jumped out of your seat when the raptor sprung out of the bushes there and took you by surprise. And even though that's only a movie and it's only on your screen and that raptor isn't really coming to get you, your brain can't tell the difference. It's in that heightened mode of fear and anticipation, and it reacts with that jump. Has that ever happened to you? And your heart's pumping away. And in fact, your body stays in that hyper-vigilant, hyperactive state for some time afterwards. I want you to think about that. You're primed for that jumpiness by a scary movie. And you can also be primed for dealing with threat in the workplace by other things that the brain perceives as threatening and responds as if it were a physical threat. Think about that. Even type in what might be some of the implications for people being hypervigilant, a bit jumpy in the workplace, a bit on guard, a bit defensive. Maybe share. And you can do that anonymously if you wish to. Type ANON before you type in. As I continue with some of the recent discoveries in neuroscience. So we know that brain states actually influence behavior. So what's going on in your brain, even not at a conscious level, what's going on there, the triggers, what happens in response to that trigger, the neurochemicals floating around awash in your brain actually influence behaviour. We know this from the research. We also know that when the brain is flicked into that defence mode, that threat response, that's actually deadly to your performance. It interferes with your performance because it changes the way you see, the way you hear, the way you process information. It has a bad effect on memory, on retaining important information. This is why in a learning situation, we want to minimize threat, make people feel comfortable in the learning environment. And sometimes just walking into a classroom can have a negative effect on people's learning if they've had bad experiences before. So that threat response is real in terms of what it does to us. And sadly, threat is longer lasting and stronger than reward. So if we're looking at this as two basic settings in the brain, threat, which puts us into defense mode, and reward or trust, that puts us into that more positive mode. But threat is stronger and longer lasting than reward. And here's an interesting one. Physical pain and social pain produce similar brain responses. That's why we're talking about the emotions here. The emotions trigger these responses, and often social pain, so that look that you get, that tone of voice that you respond to, that can actually cause people pain that produce similar brain responses. So I'm looking for your responses now. Please type in, what do you think about this information? What are the implications for you? What are some examples, perhaps, that you might share? Why don't you type some of those in? Remember, type ANON if you want to keep that anonymous. I'm just going to continue by just looking at the anatomy of the brain, where this is all happening while your responses are coming in. I'll pause in a moment and check what is actually coming up. So just some of you might be familiar with the anatomy of the brain. I'm sure Liz is. She's a vet. So we've got the brain stem that connects with the spinal column and conducts sensations from all over our body into the brain. We've got the limbic area, which is where we actually regulate our arousal and emotional reaction. And this is where the fight, flight, or freeze response is actually triggered. So our emotional reactions take place in that area, that fight, flight, or freeze. Then we have the prefrontal cortex, which you might guess is at the front of the brain, just behind our forehead. And it is the more recently developed part or evolved part of the human brain. And I'm told not present in other animals, or not well formed in other animals, because it gives us the ability to think and reason. And it's located, as I said, just behind the forehead. It's associated with our higher order thinking. Some people call it the executive brain, and it regulates the brainstem and limbic areas. It's very important because sometimes our emotional reactions can actually hijack a rational response. So emotions can override a rational response. And particularly, we do our rational thinking there, but if we're tired or hungry or stressed, it doesn't work so well. And there's a reference down the bottom of the screen. I've included it on the worksheet as well. If you're interested in this, there's a great YouTube video by Dr. Dan Siegel. It's called The Hand Model of the Brain. Now, Dan Siegel is actually, as well as a neuroscientist, he's a pediatrician, and he works with kids and families about communication and problem solving and conflict resolution, and he uses the hand model of the brain. And I saw him speak at a conference a couple of years ago, and he uses his hand, I was going to say his fist, but that might be misinterpreted. He uses his hand to actually demonstrate the anatomy of the brain in a way that kids and parents can understand and actually use really constructively. And you can do this too. If you just fold your thumb into the palm of your hand and then close your fingers over the palm. This is what Dan Siegel does. And then he talks about flipping our lids. You know, when you lose it with your kids, when they drive you to distraction, and you have an emotional outburst. He demonstrates it by letting your fingers fly up. And what that represents is your executive brain has gone to la-la land and exposed your thumb, which is the emotional part of your brain. And so emotions take over your brain. You can't do good parenting. You've lost it. You've gone into emotional reaction. And it takes a bit of self-control to actually get the executive part of your brain to function well again in that situation. I hope I'm not the only parent. I hope there's some other parents out there, or perhaps it's not just kids that drive us nuts. Sometimes our pets, sometimes our friends, sometimes our work colleagues. Have you ever lost your mind in an interaction, or maybe in the traffic? Okay, so I'm looking at some comments here. Okay, Francesca's saying, I didn't know about the freeze aspect of fight or flight. It makes a student's behaviour in our group meeting a lot more understandable. Thanks for bringing that up, Francesca. This is a really primitive part of the brain we're talking about. Think back to hunters and gatherers, cave person times. And the reason it's evolved is because we needed it for survival, the fight, the flight, and the freeze. When we lived in those times, or when our ancestors lived in those times, your survival depended on your ability to hunt down food, or perhaps the ability of others in your tribe or your extended family group to hunt down food. So you had to be, some members of the tribe were strong and fast, and when they were in the hunt, this emotional response would turn on their strength so that they could go and hunt down. But they could also be in a difficult situation where they were being hunted. The animal turned on them. They had to run away. But those of us who might have been the gatherers, or even the hunters in some situations, to survive, they would have needed to become as invisible as they could, to freeze, to be really quiet. And you're right, Francesca. I've seen this, and I've experienced this myself. There's a term too that I've often used. I was gobsmacked. That's a term that some people use when I was so stunned by something someone else did or said, I couldn't come up with a response to that. I had no words to respond, and I had no physical way of responding to what happened either. So I sort of froze. So, yeah, I was late to learn that. I was familiar with fight or flight. I think most of us are, but the freeze is good to know, and especially in the classroom, in meetings, and especially when you're dealing with someone who might be a bit more introverted, or by culture is not primed to speak up to voices of authority. So in a classroom situation in some cultures, the teacher has a lot of authority, is an authority figure, which might instigate. I know some classrooms I go into, it's very difficult to get people to ask me questions. And it might be the fear kicking in. If I put my hand up, if I ask a question, it might be one of those stupid questions. People might laugh at me. And remember, one of the things we now know is that social pain creates a similar response in the brain as physical pain. So people laughing at me can be as painful as a kick in the guts, you know. So these are things we need to understand and remember in a classroom situation and in a mentoring situation and in a business situation, a management situation. If you're talking to a subordinate, they might freeze, they might not be able to respond. So we need to have some responses so that we can give them the time, bring down that fear response, literally flip the switch into trust. And as I said, I've written about this and there's some articles there that you can download. So Tito's saying, no wonder unpleasant traumatic experiences are more prevalent and long-lasting. It will take lots of patience to help build trust than to lose it. Yes, and as we go on, I'm going to talk about the fact that even when you have had the patience and built the trust over a long period of time, it's still easy for that switch to be flipped back in an instant and you're back where you started. Well, maybe not quite where you started. If you have a history of relationship and trust, then even though that trigger you might be triggered, you still have to work at rebuilding the trust. You know, if you're a parent, as I am, and you can remember, perhaps with a little bit of shame, that time when you flipped your lid and lost it with your kids, you were able to go back to your kids and say, and I know I've done this on more than one occasion, I've had to say, I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. I lost it then. Let's sit down now more calmly and talk this through. And you rebuild those bridges. And people, and I'm sure you've had people do that with you, come back to you after an emotional outburst and say, look, I'm really sorry. I had a bunch of other things that were stressing me out. I shouldn't have taken it out on you. Let's now sit down and work this out. And sometimes it takes a little bit of time to kind of recover the actual trust, but it can be done. Okay, so let's continue. Okay, so the thing I wanted to get across is that emotional reactions are very fast and can be triggered very easily. And reminding you too that the brain is very vigilant. Every 5 seconds, your brain is automatically, without any input from you, your brain is it's like a little radar system out there looking on your behalf because it wants to keep you safe. So it's looking, is there any threat out there? Can I trust or must I defend? In safe mode, in trust mode, this is where relationships are built and conversations are productive. And this is obviously what we want in mentoring, what we need in management and leadership, and indeed in our personal relationships, productive conversations. But it's easy for them to go the other way and trigger that defensiveness. Now, I've borrowed this acronym SAFETY from Dr. Norman Chorn and Dr. Terry Hunter of the BrainLink Group. And in a presentation I recently attended, they talked about how the brain seeks safety. So this is what the acronym stands for. If you've got the worksheet for the webinar there, I've written a little bit of detail there for you. If not, just jot these down. So the S is for security. The A is for autonomy. I'm going to talk about these in more detail in a moment, each one, just giving you the acronym for now. Fairness, the F is fairness. The E stands for esteem. Then we've got trust. And then the Y stands for your personal priority. So I'm actually going to be going through each of these. So security, essentially, I'll go through in more detail, but essentially security is about certainty, predictability, stability. Autonomy is the freedom to decide and choose. Fairness is about equity, transparency, and social justice. Esteem is about your status in relation to other people and your recognition. And trust is about belonging to the group or tribe, feeling safe in relationship to others. And then the why, your personal priorities. So within these 5 levers or drivers, you might call them, there'll be one that's more important to you than the others. And as I go through them in a little bit more detail, I'm going to ask you which one can you identify as your personal priority or your dominant driver or the lever or the trigger that's the one that gets to you. And I've put a table. I'm going to be talking about each of these levers or drivers in a little bit more detail. I'm going to be giving you the sorts of things in each area that are perceived by the brain as a threat. So flick into that defend mode, and the sorts of things that are perceived by the brain as reward that build trust. And you can fill in the table as we go, and then later on we'll get to the actions. And you'll probably also be able to identify with one of these in particular that is your most dominant. So let's look first at security. So the brain has a thing about efficiency. It's actually geared to be as efficient as possible in processing. So it conserves energy by running on automatic pilot kind of thing. As often as possible. So as many processes as it can, it puts into the subconscious area and runs on automatic pilot. So routines, habits, rules of thumb we use to make millions of minor decisions each day are the ways that the brain minimizes effort and conserves its energy. These are kind of like default settings that allow us to do things without thinking. The brain hates change. It hates disruption and the unexpected because it means it has to switch off autopilot and use the executive brain to process new data. See, most of the time, the executive brain is using consciousness to deal with those things it has to. And therefore, having a whole bunch of things, you can think about it, it's like a computer has programs running in the background that you don't have to worry about while you focus on what you're doing on your desktop. The brain's a little bit like that as well. It has these automatic programs just running along in the background. You don't have to worry about those. They're taking care of things automatically. So your desktop, if you like, or your executive brain is free to deal with what you want to deal with in your consciousness. What that means is security to the brain means routine, ordinary, no surprises. And the need for security means that where there is ambiguity, confusion, or unmet expectations, that can actually flick the switch into defend mode. All of a sudden, the brain has to deal with this and it can be perceived as a threat. On the other hand, you've got familiarity. So where you've got situations where you're familiar with this situation, you've been here before, or you've dealt with something that's similar to this. Some similar experience where you're clear about expectation and you're able to be prepared, or you're forewarned or briefed about expectations. All that signals safety. Think about this in a meeting situation. So if someone has called a meeting and hasn't told you what it's about or why the meeting's being called, if it's called suddenly and you're a bit confused about what it's all about, your brain is already going into defend mode. the automatic response. There's a bit of fight or flight or freeze going on there. Whereas in a meeting situation, if it's a normal, regular, scheduled meeting, that's nothing to worry about. Even if it's an unscheduled meeting, but the person who's called the meeting has sent you a memo, an email, sent you an agenda, been clear what the reason for the meeting is, what's expected of you, perhaps giving you some tasks. Here's what's on the agenda. Would you come prepared to discuss this topic, or come with a list of questions, or come with some suggestions? Then you walk into that meeting much less stressed, much more likely or much more open to be in trust mode and have a productive meeting. I'm wondering if this is making sense to you. Please type in some comments or feedback or any observations for you. So that's security. Let's look at autonomy. What does this actually mean? Well, adults want to be self-directing. Most of us hate rigid rules. We hate being given orders or micromanaged. And we resent top-down planning that robs us of input and feels disempowering. This will trigger the brain's defenses. So some of you will have experienced, when we just get an order or something that comes down from top management, we haven't been consulted about it. Or we have some interference with our regular day-to-day work. We have that sense of micromanagement or that top-down planning, that all of those things. And look around your workplace. Think about your work colleagues. Think about responses that happen in the workplace when dictates are given. And you can understand some people's reactions perhaps now, because what the brain needs to be in that trust mode, that productive mode, is to feel like we are in control, to feel like we have choices about this matter. And we're able to work in collaboration with other people. That makes us feel, or makes our brain feel, much safer. I'm wondering if you can share some examples of these as we go through. So now we come to fairness. What will flick the lever into threat is the perception of favoritism, preferential treatment, or arbitrary decisions. You know, when you feel yourself saying, oh, that's not fair, or how come she got that, or how come he got that? And I think that's a lot of the problem of the very negative reactions and the backlash we see with the efforts for gender equity. Certainly in this country, there's been a lot of backlash against that. And I think that's because some people feel threatened by it. Okay, seeing a question. Okay, is it possible that autonomy can sometimes be considered a threat if a person's priority is more on certainty, e.g., following orders instead of having to think for oneself on what to do? You are entirely correct, Tito. I believe there are cultural influences, and when I say culture, it can be in terms of country or ethnicity. It could also be the culture of the organisation. So in some organisations or some cultures where people are taught from birth to respect authority and to follow instructions and orders and to follow what they are instructed to do by someone of a higher status or higher position in an organisation, autonomy can be a threat. I remember speaking at a conference that was online, but going into China. And in my briefing, this was particularly made clear to me. And part of the objective was they talk about the iron rice bowl in China. And this was harking back to earlier forms of communism where people expected to contribute to the community. Everyone was expected to work and contribute. But in return, there was the iron rice bowl that everyone was meant to get fed from. And over many generations, this meant following instructions, doing as they were told, and it's very difficult to get people to speak up and to break away from the idea of lifelong employment by a company and to get to the idea of managing one's own career for oneself. So you are right, autonomy could be perceived as very threatening for some cultures and some individuals. So thanks for pointing that out, Tito. Okay, let's continue, and please feel free to type in your comments as we go through. I'll have another look in a moment. In general, the fairness trigger, what triggers us into trust and safety is when there is transparency. So we can see what's going on. There's a rationale. We can understand the reasons for, and when we can see equity. But as I mentioned before, for some, equity is a fear because they personally feel threatened by that concept. And some of these interrelate and have a more dynamic effect as well. So the next one is the E for esteem. And I think some of us instinctively understand the importance of status. You know, high status individuals get more, whether it's food, money, sex, the corner office, the car or the parking spot, or better assignments at work. And the brain is constantly evaluating our status in relation to others. So feeling judged or looked down on, so that you rank lower than other people, whether that's in your position, your power, your pay scale, and even getting negative feedback. Not winning in a competitive situation, lack of money, or having to do the dirty work can lower self-esteem and raise defensiveness. On the other hand, mastery, so self-efficacy. So when you feel that you have mastery or you understand something or you're you have mastered a body of learning, can help you feel that you are safe. So for students, their feeling of safety will increase with success as they complete units of study and they can see that they've succeeded in consecutive areas of study. Each year, they'll still have a little bit of apprehension, but knowing they've got that experience behind them, well, this was apprehensive, this was difficult at the beginning, but I mastered it. I know I love to travel and I love to learn the language of the place I'm traveling to if I can. And I use audio language courses. And I remember the very first one. I was going to Prague in the Czech Republic. And so I got an audio learning program of the Czech language. And the first lesson, I heard a conversation at the beginning of it. They had a recording of a conversation in the Czech language. And I thought, I'm never going to be able to learn this. I will never understand. I will never be able to speak a single word of this. But as I continued and I persevered with the lessons, I eventually was not only able to understand, but I was able to speak and make myself understood. Not well, and only a few words, because I was only in Prague for about a week or 10 days. But I was able to get myself out of some difficult situations because I was able to speak a little bit of the language. And I've also found anywhere I go, if you have even a few words and make the effort, people will respond much more favourably to you because you're showing some respect. And I think it comes back to this esteem. If you show enough respect to people to learn even a few words of their language, their esteem is raised and your position in their esteem is raised also, and they're more cooperative. That's my experience anyway, although it is very hard to learn some language. And I must admit Tagalog was rather hard for me, and I don't know that I've got any words in that yet. So trust. This is the big one. So the brain responds by going into defense mode. If a person feels rejected, where they feel isolated, loneliness, feeling different and socially disconnected, very, very threatening and cause great pain. I have a theory that this is the reason we see right around the world some young people very vulnerable to being recruited to terrorist organisations in other countries. So here in Australia, in England, and in other countries, in France, where young people are quite vulnerable and are recruited by predators because those predators understand that young people often feel rejected by the dominant culture and even by their own families. In some cases, because they're a little bit different, because they're young, a little bit outspoken or something like that. They feel isolated. And so they're very vulnerable to people who want to include them, who tell them how great they are, who build their self-esteem and make them fall into the trap of trusting them because they're different. Well, they find a group that shares some of their views and actually cultivates some of these different views. So what we see is a misuse of this information, and these predators are very skillful at making people feel included, at empathy, building rapport, empathy, friendship, and making people feel safe within this particular band. So this is something we can use to our advantage as well. So I'm going to just give you the summary again. So we've got the 5 levers or drivers, if you like. I'm wondering if you can relate to one of these in particular. And I'm going to launch a poll so you can indicate and we can share that information. So which do you think? Is there one of these that is the number one for you, that you can really relate to more than others? And this is important because okay, I'll tell you what's important in just a moment. So seeing those votes coming in, some of us see a very strong preference for one over the other. They're all important to us. They all will flick the switch in our brains, but there's one in particular that may be a trigger for you. Okay. Okay, just give you a few seconds more as I see these votes coming in. We've got about 60%. So thinking about it, looking back over your notes, is it security, so certainty, predictability, stability, autonomy, freedom to decide and make your own choices, fairness, so equity, transparency, and not just for you. If fairness is your thing, it's likely that you're interested in social justice, fairness for everybody, esteem, your status in relation to others. This is anonymous, so feel free to choose the one. Or trust, belonging to the group, the tribe, safety in relationships. Okay, so 74%. I know we've got a couple of people on the phone who won't be able to vote, so we might just close this poll so that we can continue. I'm going to share with you the results. Let's have a look. Okay, so only 77% said security. And 36%, so that was the highest. Autonomy. Now, we're not a random sample here, obviously. All of us are quite experienced in our particular field, and that may have an influence on these. I'm not sure what the data says. A lot of us thinking about fairness, transparency, and that social justice, equity for everybody, esteem, 14%, trust and belonging to the tribe, safe in relationship, 14%. Okay, let me pop that away now. And let's continue because I want to get into some actions. The reason it's important to know which is your dominant driver here is one of the issues is that because we find one of those most rewarding ourselves, we'll try to offer that most to others. Unfortunately, if there's a mismatch, so say, so my dominant is autonomy. And as Tito pointed out, that's not great for everyone because in some cultures, or some people might really prefer that certainty. So if I'm offering you a lot of autonomy and freedom, which is my preference, but you value security, clear guidelines, certainty, that could be a barrier in our relationship and in our communications. So just think about your dominant. If that's what you're offering to the world, you tend to provide that to other people, but maybe that's not what they most need. And I'd like you to, make a note of that as something to reflect on. I hope that will be a takeaway for you. So if you've got the worksheet, I'm going to look at the actions now that might be useful, and you might want to jot some of these down as you go. So some of the actions, useful in mentoring in particular, also managing, leading people, but also for the educators out there in the classroom, I'm imagining you can use this too. And please feel free to share. So in order to serve people in their area of security, agreeing the ground rules, discussing expectations, sharing the agenda prior to any meeting. These are the things that will help put their brains into trust mode, help make them less defensive, more open, more likely to have a productive meeting, a productive conversation, a productive classroom. Okay, autonomy. So you can help people flick into trust mode by listening and asking more questions of them and responding in such a way that you show you're listening and you're asking those questions respectfully. You're ensuring that if they ask a question, they're not made feel small and that you are open to those questions. So helping them make their own decisions. In a mentoring situation, we're not telling people what to do. We're helping them figure out what to do for themselves and helping them take responsibility for their own actions. So when it comes to fairness, that equity, transparency, social justice, yourself seeing both sides of an argument, being open to argument. I always taught my kids when they were young that you could disagree with anyone as long as you did it respectfully. So using respectful language, both verbal and non-verbal, showing your respect. And you can show another side of an argument without telling people they're wrong. You can say, I disagree. There's a big difference between saying, I disagree and saying you're wrong, which automatically puts people into a defensive mode. So difference of perspectives and championing equity. Actually speaking up about social justice, showing that you support it, particularly if you're in a position of status and respect. So esteem, status in relation to others, recognition. So treating people as equals, even if they're younger than you, even if they're older than you, if they have a different position. So treating people as much as possible as equals. And I know this doesn't come easily to many people. Not patronising people, being slow to give advice, even when asked. Immediately you start giving advice, you're actually lowering the status of the person you're giving it to, which can trigger their brain into defend mode. So it can be quite counterproductive. Giving positive feedback and or getting them to reflect and recall their own success. And I find this an incredibly powerful technique where where you actually get people to talk about what they've been doing, talk about their experience, and get them to recall. You might have to point it out to them in the beginning, but you can use some very good questions to bring out. So what did you do in that situation that worked really well? So in hindsight, can you see what you did that got that great outcome? So getting them to reflect and congratulate themselves as well. So the trust, making sure you build rapport every time. I'm going to go into this one in a bit more depth because it is the biggie that we have to keep doing this every time. Even if we've already established a relationship, we're going to need to keep building it and restore it if it's ever lost. So build rapport every time. Keeping confidentiality when that's appropriate. Being willing to disclose, to share information about yourself, and to actually show that you trust them. So you can comment, share some observations. I'm going to really quickly share another acronym with you for trust that I hope you'll find useful. So this acronym is TRUST: together, respect, understanding, success, and talk. So T stands for together. So being able to create a sense of we're in this together, we're partners, we're allies. And I'm talking about mentoring situations. I'm talking about management and leadership. I'm talking about personal relationships. I'm talking about in the classroom. Can we build a sense that we are partners, we're allies? We may be different, but we've come together with a common goal to have conversations and interactions that will create positive outcomes. Just pausing to look at a comment that's come in. Okay, so we've got Liz saying, I feel I'm personally driven by both esteem and trust. So, yeah, Liz, I think it's quite possible that there could be two that are interacting together for individuals. So it's good to know where you're coming from and to try and figure out where other people are coming from as well. So let's look at some more actions in the trust area. Respect. We listen to each other. We build rapport by finding what we have in common. We accept the inevitability that we are different, perhaps by gender, culture, age, experience, beliefs, or points of view. We accept that we are free to hold and share our own opinions and a different perspective, and we might have the right to disagree. I find this is getting quite difficult now. I use social media a lot, and it amazes me how people will jump on someone quite horribly in some cases without respect for a different point of view. And it's very difficult to say, look, I disagree. I found a bunch of my friends making comments about something that came up topically recently, and it's we have a tendency, we've slipped into this tendency to use the word guys. Hi guys, hello guys, oh you guys. And now in Australia, the Australian of the Year has actually come out and said, you know what, using that word guys is discriminatory. It's actually disrespectful to women. It says women don't exist. And I agree with that. And I felt like I was the only one in the world who was actually offended by being called a guy. Then I saw people on social media saying, oh, that's ridiculous. That's stupid. I'm a woman. I don't object to it, so it can't be a problem. And I thought, will I even make a comment here? Because these are my friends and they might jump on me for having a different point of view. So I took a punt and I said, okay, I disagree. You're my friends, so I understand if you want to keep using it, but please understand that I feel it ignores 50% of the population, my 50%. And then I did a separate post and I found some people agreeing with that. So I felt a bit better. So I see getting some responses here. Yeah, people are agreeing and saying frustrating that people can be quite remorseless on social media and disrespectful. Maybe we have to show them the way. Okay, so Andre is saying, are there visual, i.e. facial body language cues that can cause a break in trust? Yes, there certainly are. And you have to be careful culturally too, because I know I do a lot of work with Australian Aboriginal people, and for Australian Aboriginal people, maintaining eye contact can be regarded as quite disrespectful and not something you do with a higher status person or an elder. So a young Aboriginal person would find holding eye contact with me as an older person quite disconcerting and difficult. So there's cultural aspects there. And in fact, if I maintained eye contact with an Aboriginal person, that could be breaking trust with that person. So I have to be quite cautious about my normal, natural, default body language that is not meant to be disrespectful but can be interpreted as disrespectful. Whereas for my culture, looking away, not maintaining eye contact can be interpreted as shifty or guilty or not trustworthy. So we do need to be careful. So you can break trust too by getting too close to someone, literally being in their face or in their personal space. And space is another one that's cultural as well. Aggressive body language will often be, even at an unconscious level, aggressive body language will be taken in. Your brain is vigilant and it will interpret and react to that. So thanks for bringing that up, Andre. Let's quickly continue. I see our time is getting away here. A little bit more to cover. Understanding. So we need to actually slow our thinking down and reduce those hasty assumptions, conclusions, or judgment. Instead, we need to explore context and each other's reality. Use our empathy, get a sense of what it might be like for each other. We inquire, we are curious, and we keep an open mind. So switching on that executive function really consciously, damping down emotional responses and putting our executive in control. Success. Share positive intention. We build a constructive relationship. We sense that our action has power to produce beneficial results. We set goals and work towards positive outcomes. And finally, talk. Our conversation is purposeful. We create a safe space where we can be candid and open to share thoughts and feelings. We can exchange views non-defensively. One of the best things you can do is be non-defensive. So don't jump to the defense of a particular point of view or an argument. Understand and be willing to accept and even encourage different points of view. The more you demonstrate that and model that behaviour, the more trust you're going to build. So we discuss issues, problems, choices, and collaborate to generate ideas, alternatives, and possibilities. Communication is two-way, and we give each other and we receive honest feedback so that we learn from each other and grow. So, starting to wrap this up now, we've talked about the 5 ways, those 5 levers or drivers, the domains where the brain seeks safety. We talked about the impact of dominant drivers and given you some ideas about what managers and mentors can do to build trust and minimise defence mode. So I'd love to, I'm going to stick around. I know we've reached our time now, but I will stick around as long as you want to respond to your questions. And just make sure you've got in your diary the 30th of June. If it's still Thursday where you are, it will be Thursday the 30th of June. If it's Friday where you are now, then it will be Friday the 1st of July, our next webinar, and I'll send you some information about that. And if you've enjoyed the webinar and you'd like a webinar especially designed for you, do drop me an email or type in and I'll make contact with you and we can talk about that. But for now, I'll stick around and answer your questions. And I'm particularly interested in what your key takeaways. So just review your notes, and if you would share, what's a key point you'll take away from this webinar today? And I'm particularly interested in what actions you might be going to take as a result. So, looking for questions, comments, actions before we wrap up the session. I'll stay on the line as long as there are questions coming in. If you do have to leave, I understand, that's fine. I might stop the recording, but I'm going to stick around and answer questions for you. So if you're watching the recording, thank you very much for being a part of this webinar, and I hope to see you live sometime soon.